I'm going to introduce our string of folks that are ready to give testimony to Rosemary's impact on their lives. But first, John Cobb, we're going to give you an opportunity to just say a word about our theme for the day and our heroine for the day.
Well, I think it's wonderful that we have this opportunity. Rosemary influenced millions of people. I think her influence was greater than any other one person with whom we have congeniality. She went at times on our conferences. I remember going, she went with us to Latin America one time. But she told me one thing she would never do would be to read a word written by Whitehead. Clear indication that one can come to sensible ideas without necessarily reading the same people. Great woman, wonderful human being. So pleased we can honor her today.
Thank you, John. I'm going to introduce these persons that are going to help us today, one person at a time. And we'll begin with Dr. Renny Golden, who actually wrote a nice tribute to Rosemary for the National Catholic Reporter back in June. But Renny has taught in the Northeastern Illinois University for 27 years, as well as years teaching at Harvard Divinity School, Walpole Prison, Columbia College, and most recently professor emeritus at the University of New Mexico. We could do a whole program on her writings and poetry, for which she has been given awards. She's also the co-founder of the Chicago Religious Task Force on Central America and spent time in El Salvador accompanying refugees seeking sanctuary. Renny, you've helped us put this whole thing together, and give us whatever introduction you'd like to make to Rosemary Radford Reuther, the ecofeminist, liberation theology scholar, internationalist, and social activist, and to the video in which we'll hear Rosemary's own voice. Renny Golden, you're on.
Well, I want to thank the Cobb Institute and Ron Hines for their interest in paying tribute to Rosemary. And I feel like both Mary Elizabeth and John have already lauded Rosemary as a transformative person whose legacy remains with us. You would think that a tribute to a scholar who has written almost 40 books, whose own work crossed several disciplines. Rosemary was, her PhD was in patristics and classics. And her own work was pretty much grounded in a sociology of knowledge. And she was both a feminist and liberation theologian. So you would think we would begin with her work, but it's not being contrarian. It's that I have been a Freirean practitioner. So we're going to begin with her practice. What I think is unique with Rosemary's life is that she was a scholar and an activist. And the video we will see shortly will be an indication of a revelation of Rosemary's life based on her own understanding of her praxis. So she will speak for herself. Finally, Rosemary was, just to say it quickly, an Old Testament prophet, bold and brave. But it cost her. She was never able to teach in a Catholic university. And yet it was her historical sense and her work that really saved my faith. So I will let Rosemary tell you what her own life practice was that is living out the ethics that she inveighed. Richard?
Talk this morning about the interconnections of race, class, and gender, as that grounded the development of my own feminist theology and that of a cohort of feminist theologians, such as Letty Russell and Bev Harrison, whose thought was shaped by similar contexts in the 1960s, namely the civil rights, anti-war, and New Left movements. I want to focus on this theme because I think it has been somewhat misinterpreted or forgotten by feminists in the academy and theological schools who began their work in the 80s and 90s, or, of course, in the 21st century. Now, the general storyline that I find among my students in feminist theology and theological schools today, reinforced by a number of articles and books, is that feminist theology began in some indeterminate period, but the assumption was that this was somehow the late 60s. It began with white feminists, sometimes sort of one word, white feminists, white feminists who were oblivious to class and race difference among women. It was these bad white feminists who had no sense of class and race were then critiqued by a growing diversity of women in theological schools from many different racial and cultural contexts for their false universalism and brought to task for their foolish belief that women's experience was some kind of generic universal. And of course, now we know better. Now, I have no doubt at all that this was the way in which a lot of feminism was, in fact, experienced in theological schools. As African American and sort of Ada Maria and Hispanic women and so on began to get into theological schools in the 80s, and feminist theology had gained something of a foothold in universities and theological schools. What I want to point out is that this storyline deeply violates and, in fact, erases my own experience and that of a cohort of feminist theologians who began their work in the late 60s. Now, perhaps it's important to point out here that there was not one, but at least two, rather different contexts in which feminism, the feminist movement, arose in the mid to late 60s. And one was the movement of women lawyers and government workers, writers, out of which the National Organization of Women arose, featured, as you see, on as the icon of the conference. And this movement, I think, was open to class, not particularly sensitive to race. And at least some leaders, Betty Friedan in particular, was threatened by the lesbian movement. She went conspiratorially around speaking of the Lavender Menace, if you remember. And there was a second movement, which arose from the civil rights and anti-war and New Left movements, Black Power movement, and this was the context in which my own feminist perspective emerged. Now, the scenario of white feminists oblivious to race, class, and global context undoubtedly, as I said, reflected realities in the 60s. And I wonder whether this had perhaps become more so in the mid and late 70s as feminism became an established discourse in the academy. But my own experience was almost the opposite of this scenario. In the 60s, I became immersed in the civil rights movement. In 1965, along with a whole group of students and chaplains at the Claremont colleges in Claremont, California, I went to spend the summer as a volunteer with the Delta Ministry in Mississippi. Now, this was a scary decision because the previous summer, which was called the Mississippi Summer, 3 young civil rights workers had been killed, and their bodies had been hidden by local whites. So we went to Mississippi with some conscious awareness that we were risking our lives. And I remember as we crossed the state line into Mississippi in our battered car, which we drove from California, thinking that I might die, and deciding that I had to be willing to face that risk. Now, let me be clear, I have no tendencies toward martyrdom, and I was the mother of 3 young children, so I was not seeking death. But I think there are moments in your life when you come face to face with death and the possibility that if you cross a certain line, someone could kill you. And that was that kind of defining moment for me when one had to decide, are you going to be governed by fear or are you going to go ahead? Now, for me, the 1965 summer in Mississippi was a critical turning point in my life. For the first time, I experienced what white America looks like from the context of blacks, specifically in this framework in the South, in Mississippi. And I came to recognize whites as very scary and threatening people. People who would kill my black colleagues at the drop of a hat and would kill me, possibly, for taking their side. Now, our group of volunteers was based at a black college, or former black college, in Beulah, Mississippi. We had all these programs that were based at that college, or former college. And I decided to volunteer with the Head Start program. I traveled around rural Mississippi with another colleague, an African-American woman from Brooklyn, visiting Head Start programs in rural churches. Now, shortly before we had arrived, a group of whites had in fact driven through our college and sprayed gunfire at the windows of all of the dormitories. They just drove through spraying bullets at the windows. And so we mounted a night watch. Each of us would take our turn, staying up all night, a couple of us together, to guard the community from another such invasion. We had a very formidable defense. If such whites did drive through, we would ring a bell. And everybody was supposed to dive under their bed. You know, this was, well, it's better than being in your bed and have a bullet come through the window. So we were to, that was our work was to nightly watch for such an invasion and warn people to duck under their bed. Now, during my travels through Mississippi with my colleague, she and I decided to go over to Bogalusa, Louisiana for a couple of days. Do any of you remember Bogalusa? What was happening in Bogalusa, Mississippi in 1965? It was basically a town that was being besieged by the Ku Klux Klan. And there was a group of young blacks of the town that were, again, mounting a night watch. They called themselves the Deacons for Defense. And so they were watching nightly for this. And the Ku Klux Klan were literally surrounding the town. So we spent a couple of days with that community. And here I had an even more dramatic taste of what it meant to be black in America, literally living under siege by whites. Now, when I returned from Mississippi, went back to California, another African-American friend of mine, Minette Lal, who had been in Mississippi also, she and I decided to become volunteers in Watts, a black neighborhood in Los Angeles, which had gone up in flames that summer. And we worked with militant black and white clergy who trained us in the proper way of working in the black community, as well as nonviolent methods of resistance in marches and sit-ins. Okay, so after that period of being in Mississippi and then in Watts, my family and I moved to Washington, D.C., where for the next 10 years I taught at the Howard University School of Religion, a historical black university. Our family committed itself to live in a black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and we added work against the war in Vietnam to our work against racism. I think my children grew up thinking that what you do when you go in downtown Washington is picket the White House. You know, this was... Now, during this period, I became steeped in the critique of racism, class hierarchy, and American neocolonial intervention. That was the whole discourse of our, shall we say, our community. So it was not race, class, or global awareness that were missing. What was missing was gender. Gender analysis was not welcome in the circles that had moved me to critical consciousness in the 1960s and early 70s. My mentors in the civil rights and anti-war movements were white and black leftist males, most of them clergy, black theology, liberation, third world liberation theologies, these were being founded at that time. And so I drank in a critique of American classist, racist, and militarist society. Among my first books was a collection of essays that I had written between 1968 and 71 called Liberation Theology: Human Hope Confronts Christian History and American Power. It's published in 72. The book contains essays on black theology, Jewish-Christian relations, Christian anti-Semitism, communitarian socialism, the white left in America, Latin American liberation theology, along with two early essays on feminist theology and on ecology. My essay on black theology was based on the early work of Jim Cone, and my essay on Latin American liberation theology cites the book of Gustavo Gutierrez, at that point not yet translated into English. Now, my working assumptions in these essays, as in all of my subsequent work, is that liberation theology is multidimensional. We need to look at it from a diversity of context, a wide range of contexts. And it was in the late 60s that I began to add the questions of gender to what was then, in the circles in which I moved, the established race, class, and anti-colonial discourse. In 1968, I wrote and gave my first major essay on sexism, which was titled Male Chauvinist Theology and the Anger of Women. I thought it was kind of sprightly title. I mean, what I found was the word anger absolutely terrified the white community. I mean, I was, living in the world of black power. Anger rhetoric was just kind of normal. So I was kind of surprised by how galvanized and, frightened, shall we say, white men were by the term anger of women. However, at the Howard School of Religion, where I taught from 1965 to 76, there was little openness to black theology, not to mention feminism. I mean, feminism wasn't even on the map. The faculty was mostly older African Americans who had struggled in the 40s and 50s to establish middle-class respectability. And they preferred to be called Negroes, capital N, and shuddered at the word black, which they saw as close to a racist insult. I was the first faculty member to introduce the writings of Jim Cone at the seminary, although one of my colleagues, Dr. Deotis Roberts, would begin to develop a black theology that was consciously more conservative and more, quote, reconciling than that of Cone. My early article on black theology, which I mentioned above, was an effort to respond to this critique coming from my colleagues and to defend Cone's views, rooted in what I saw as a positive reading of black power. Now, gender was not mentioned in this article. Teaching at a historic black seminary, gender was a very touchy subject coming from a white woman, but also from black women. There were few younger black women at the seminary when I first came. Women students were mainly older black women who were in a secondary degree program offered to urban women pastors who did not have a college degree. So I began to develop my first systematic and historical work in feminist theology in a leave of absence in which I taught at Harvard Divinity School. I jokingly, when I was up here, referred to Harvard as the White Howard of America, because you see, Howard always called itself the Black Harvard. So I said, well, here at the White Howard of America. By the way, I have to tell you another little story about that year. I was invited, as Ann Browdy mentioned yesterday, to be the Stillman Professor. Harvey Cox was kind of handing out the Stillman Professor year by year in those days, because at that point they were still kind of nervous at having Catholics who might be here for more than 1 year at a time. But a certain other German professor decided that I was insufficiently eminent to hold the Stillman Professor, so I should be paid by it but not hold the title. So I went about gleefully saying that I was under the Stillman chair but not on it. I taught an absolutely wonderful group of students, and you've heard some of those names already: Linda Barafaldi, Emily Culpepper, terrific group of women. I had taught one course where I tried to trace the rise of patriarchy, patriarchal religions in the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world, and the shaping of early Christianity. And then another on the 19th century European misogynist anthropologies and the beginnings of feminism. Those were my two courses. But I also taught a course on Christian anti-Judaism, looking particularly at its patristic roots. And these lectures became the book Faith and Fratricide, The Christian Roots of Anti-Semitism, published in '74. Now, I have to say that the feminists at Harvard Divinity School seemed a bit puzzled by why I would be teaching this course. Anti-Judaism in Christianity was not seen as a topic of feminism in those days. From my perspective, all the structures of discrimination, race and class, as well as gender, but also religious discrimination, Christian religious imperialism, that all of these were part of the critique of feminism. Now, my work on feminist theology was then developed in a second year after the year I was at Harvard, in a series of lectures at Yale Divinity School. And thereafter, I taught this material several times at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington. I did not try to teach a course in feminist theology at Howard. In one course on contemporary ethical issues, I introduced one lecture on gender, and I asked a black male clergy friend to lead this lecture. He was, in fact, extremely good at this because he could really talk about the sexism of black males to black males. I could not do that. And it was really evident to me that the topic of sexism in the black community was very volatile. And I, as a white woman, was not going to be able to address that. My students at Howard were almost all black men, not only African Americans, but Caribbeans, Africans. It was actually a very global community, but predominantly black. But there was no available black women to discuss gender issues in terms of theology at Howard at that time. And if there had been, they would have had a hard time being heard. And of course, I realized this in asking a black male cleric to speak on sexism. At that point, critical perspectives on gender relations could hope to get a hearing from black males only from another black male. And in fact, the students listened with very skeptical expressions, even to him. But he was a black male cleric, and so they accorded him some respect. Now, toward the second half of my period there in the early 70s, some younger black women were beginning to enter Howard, women who had graduated from college and were going into the MDiv, so a new generation was entering of younger black women, and they began to express an interest in gender issues. And in 1975, a latent tension over this issue exploded. A young black woman student did her master's thesis on gender critique of theology in the black church. Our faculty was a small one, there was only 8, and it was customary to review the master's theses as a total faculty. This young woman was roundly ridiculed by the acting dean of the faculty, and the other faculty sort of passively backed him up. I intervened to defend her, and the hostility was turned onto me. The acting dean called me into his office and threatened to fire me. In his view, my defense of this young woman student had insulted the faculty, namely himself. At that time, I had no tenure. I taught there 10 years without a single sabbatical. I had no tenure, and so I was vulnerable to dismissal. However, this attack did not worry me very much, because I was privy to 2 pieces of information that he did not know, namely that I was on the search committee to bring in a new dean. And we decided to bring Dr. Lawrence Jones from Union Theological Seminary to become the dean of Howard. So I knew that things were going to change at Howard when he came. A new generation of Black scholars identified with the Black theological perspective were going to be asked to teach. Secondly, a school near Chicago, Garrett Theological Seminary, had invited me to come and become the Georgia Harkness Professor of Applied Theology. And there, feminist theology would in fact be defined as central to my work. Now, Garrett had already made a strong commitment to a large number of Black students and faculty and the doing of theological education in the context of what Garrett called the church and the Black experience. Jim Cohn had done his MDiv at Garrett and his PhD at Garrett Northwestern. In the 50s and 60s, he had been deeply critical of Garrett's lack of attention to race issues. But Garrett at least had tried to heed his call in the 70s and attempted to make the Black perspective a major commitment to theological education, as it remains to this day. Okay, I have about one more minute. So the president was also very sensitive to the fact that feminism should come in a way that really was in dialogue with race issues, and that was clearly why they were interested in me, since I had been there at Howard for 10 years. But I had also become convinced that it was time to leave Howard. Precisely as a white woman, I could not initiate the dialogue about gender, and I knew that Lawrence Jones would bring in some not only younger Black scholars, but younger Black women scholars, as indeed they have. I mean, we have wonderful people like Kelly Brown Douglas. She, by the way, would have been a nice person here to be coming. Now, since that time, of course, a whole new reality has exploded. Many, much greater diversity in theological education, African-American women, Hispanic women, and increasingly from a diversity of religious perspectives have come in, and all of that is, to me, absolutely essential. In other words, I think that feminist theology has to be done in every context. If we really believe that race, class, religion, all of these diversities exist, that in each of these places where these different contexts connect, there needs to be a diversity of voices really expressing that. So I have always been really delighted at the increasing diversity of perspectives, and feel that even though, in the 60s we had a discourse about that, what we obviously didn't have was the colleagues in the Hispanic community, the Black community, Asian, American Indian, increasingly from Jewish and Muslim perspectives. A casual glance around this assembly would make clear. But we also really need to listen respectfully to our very particular stories. Thank you.
Listening to our particular stories respectfully is what we were going to be about and what we're doing from now on. Renny Golden has a poem that she'd like to share that's related to the work in Latin America. Renny, I think I'm going to ask you to hold that until after Elaine Padilla. Elaine Padilla is needing to go to teach in a class at 11 o'clock, and I want to make sure we get in her time beforehand. Will that work for you okay, Renny?
Sure.
Yeah. Elaine Padilla, student of Catherine Keller, professor at the University of Laverne in religion and philosophy, and companion with Rosemary on many trips to Latin America. Share what you'd like to share. Elaine?
So I want to just thank you so much for having me here today. One of the areas of interest of my study, my own research, is feminism. And Rosemary Radford Reuther has been very influential for me as well. By the way, my meeting is a meeting that I have. I'm not teaching a class today, but I do have to. I apologize for having to step out early. I wanted to say, and I think that what I want to continue on with what the video was telling us is two things. One is that the legacy of Rosemary Radford Reuther is continuing, not only in my generation, but I'm hoping that the generation of students that I am also teaching at the moment. And I wanted to say, and by the way, I'm associate professor at the University of La Verne. I teach philosophy, religion, and Latinx and Latin American studies. And I have been influenced by Rosemary Radford Reuther, as well as by Catherine Keller. And one person that she mentioned that often gets neglected when people talk about my number of many women who have influenced me is Ada Marisa Diaz. She was a professor at Drew University when I was there. And as a feminist, I was also highly influenced by her. And so I appreciate so much Rosemary mentioning her name in her lecture and actually stating the need for feminisms that are feminisms of the margin. And so this is what I want to talk about very briefly. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I did want to share with you a couple things. One of them is how do I bring her into the classroom, and what are the things that I share about her in the classroom? So I wanted to share a couple things like portions of my syllabi, just to share with you. I teach a class on God Talk in Feminist Religious Discourse. And I have included her work here. Some of the pieces that I have shared about her are related to her books and her writings, particularly on goddesses. So I'm going to share this portion with you on my syllabus. Here you're going to see that I have Radford Reuther's book, Goddesses and the Divine Feminine, for instance. And I have included her work on the various female deities, the relationship to, the male-female relationship of these deities, early ways in which we can see depictions of the divine in female form, and also how we can argue against the masculinization of images in religious discourse, as well as how we can make room for seeing the divine in female form in other traditions. And this is where I also intersect Radford Reuther with other forms of female divine depictions, such as the goddesses in Latin America, the Aztec goddesses and Madonnas, and the Virgin of Guadalupe. So this is how I bring Radford Reuther into a Hispanic serving institution, and her feminism becomes highly relevant to my students. I have also used Rosemary's book for in my introduction to religion class, particularly her Sexism and God Talk, and why is it important and significant for us to consider the feminism in religious discourse. So I am finding that, as also Mary Elizabeth Moore said, that her hope is that her legacy continues on, and it is continuing on in our classrooms, and it is continuing on also among women who are Latinas, women who are African American, and how she has been a voice and a great influence to us. I also wanted to mention one of the trips that I made to Nicaragua with Catherine Keller, Ignacio Castuera, and Joe Bracken. We went to Nicaragua for a conference on cosmologies with Ernesto Cardenal, and she, interestingly enough, one of the things that she was doing right after that conference was to have meet with a group of Latin American women on reproductive rights, a Catholic women on reproductive rights. And so that was, for me, that one of the most fascinating things about Rosemary was that I knew she was stepping into some landmines in the Catholic Church, and she was not afraid to do so. I want to share a few of the pictures of that trip because I think it's one of the most beautiful memories I have of Rosemary as a person, just to spend those days with her. And I just want to share that experience with you. So here's just a picture of her. You can see Catherine Keller here. You can see Ernesto Cardenal and Rosemary and Ignacio Castuera right behind Ernesto Cardenal. And I am just here to the side in the corner, and Joe Bracken is right next to Ignacio.
Is that Jorge Pixley up front?
Yeah, and Jorge Pixley,
Jorge
by the way,
Pixley,
yes.
or-
Jorge was there as well in that trip. Thank you for reminding me.
Thank you.
And here you're gonna see another picture of her, of course, a very similar picture, a group picture. And there you see Jorge Pixley, yes. And let me see, I want to show you this one because this one is very special. This is my little selfie trying to you know, have Rosemary, some of Rosemary rub on me. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I feel really honored. I think that she is an amazing human being, and I have great memories, and I have a great admiration for her work, and her legacy will continue on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. I think, Renny, this might be a good place for you to share the poem that you were going to share, and any other comment you might want to say as a way to introduce the poem or link it to the lecture that we had seen earlier.
Well, one could say a lot, but I think other speakers here will cover some of Rosemary's other practices,
Okay.
from Palestine through Central America, etc. So this is just a poem for her. It's called The Chispa Carrier. Chispa in Spanish means spark. She came to prison with a key. The way forward, she said, is behind us. With only a spoon of history, she gutted a tunnel that ran below the plazas of princes. We sat waiting behind bars. Moldy histories, slop theologies in mush bowls shoved under cell doors. Eat this or starve. We prayed for a deliverance we could not name. We imagined her walking through deserts, our prophet, searching sand for bones, pouring through ancient scripts, gospels, archives, the dank stacks of basement libraries. We rattled the bars. Can she pick the locks? Can the past be more than our requiem? She kept digging until truth slithered forth, a sacred snake that recalled the hour of women. It was our singing, she said, that opened the tombs. And there, everything rising from the hidden, the desert in bloom, purple cholla, fingers of scarlet ocotillo. Women rising too. singing incendiary songs.
Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Ann Wire, who was a neighbor here at Pilgrim Place with Rosemary. And Ann was on the faculty at San Francisco School of Theology and also on the graduate school in San Francisco. Ann?
Yes, thank you, Ron. I'm going to share just a few of my experiences of how I got to know Rosemary, because I can't say very much in a short time, but perhaps some concrete experiences will give you a sense of what she meant to me in my development. The first scene I described was at a student's doctoral defense. Many of you know those tense moments when there's a small table with a few faculty sitting around and the student trying to defend their work before this variety of people who wouldn't agree on anything. I knew that Rosemary was going to be there. This was before I had even met her. She came and sat at the far end of the table, which she was the outside reader from another institution, so didn't realize that was the head of the table, but it indeed was a very appropriate place for her to sit. And she, well, I was speaking before she was. This was not a final defense, but what we called in those days a primary, the first defense, where the student, after having written a few chapters, was meeting with the committee to hear what their evaluations were and to see where she would continue her work to complete the dissertation. And so it was an opportunity much more congenial, I think, than when you deal only with the finished work. And so I had a few things to say. This was about someone that was a text that was not quite in my field. It was the book of Paul and Thecla, which is probably 2nd century. And I'm in a biblical student, so New Testament and the 1st century is where I've spent most of my time in Pauline studies. And so since this was Paul and Thecla, they put me on the committee as well. And I spoke to her with some suggestions about other texts which might help to back up her thesis about a feminist reading of the Paul and Thecla text, and suggesting that these other texts would be helpful because people will jump very quickly on her for focusing so exclusively on the female character and not on Paul himself, so that she would need some other books and specifically other of the apocryphal acts where women characters were important, to show that this was not a marginal matter. And otherwise, I encouraged her to consider how people would hear her work and what she would need to do, because after all, you want to eventually publish your research, and you've got to think about who is going to allow the publishing and how to be what you might say conciliatory, or at least to address the kind of objections that many people would have. Now, when Rosemary spoke, she did none of this kind of thing. She went immediately to the text itself of Paul and Thecla, and recognizing that Thecla is the main character in the text, ignored the role of Paul and ignored what people might say, and talked about several parts of the text that the student had not noticed that could help support her thesis. A very positive and encouraging word that Rosemary gave her. And I was quite impressed, and not only with Rosemary, but with just how you could look at this text in a way that I hadn't done. So from there on, I'm going to, well, I want to share a couple of other things more briefly. One was that when Rosemary in 1998 wrote what I consider her magnum opus, namely this book, A Woman and Redemption, a theological history, she takes a broad scope of Christian history from its beginnings all the way to the present, and shows the developments and how the church evolved. And I'm going to read a sentence or two here just to give you an idea of her thesis. Here she says, Christianity from its beginning to the end of the 2nd century, with continuing repercussions into the present, represents different worldviews, those forms that stress a more realized eschatology at one end of the spectrum, that is, inner authority and the right to act out our expressions of redemption here and now, by discarding home, family, possessions, and marks of social differentiation between men and women, had wide play and were the predominant church in some places, although other Christianities that stressed continuing sin, the need for external authority, and accommodation to existing family and sociopolitical forms were not lacking from the early beginnings. And so she traces these two channels. And what impressed me, since I know less about the whole scope of Christian history, was how in the field that I do know well, and in the way in which she used the work that I had done in my book on the Corinthian women prophets to support her thesis. She had actually read the book, which is very unusual among people who critique your work. I'm sure you all know that. And she had the thesis of my book integrated into her thesis, and she was able to use the evidence that I had developed, and with credit to me, but not that she talked about me. I wasn't mentioned except in the notes, but she used the evidence to further her discussion. And that is only maybe happened a few times in all of my history, that people read well enough to use what you say in developing their own theses. Now, the third thing I mentioned is after we came here to Pilgrim Place, and Rosemary, was a good friend by that time. She had developed a cancer on her lip, and she had to have an operation. And after the operation, she was having trouble speaking because her lip didn't function the way that it had in the past. And so she was taking lessons from a speech therapist. And at that time, she was invited to go to South Africa because people there were interested in the work that she had written about South Africa. Talk about the breadth of her practices, that it was not only Latin America and Palestine, but South Africa was another place where she wrote about and where she had taken part in their liberation movement. And so she wanted to go to her speech date, even though she could hardly talk. And I was doubtful that she should try to undertake the trip in the state she was in, and wasn't yet back to full health. But she insisted upon it, and she worked with her speech therapist to the point that she was able to get there, to make her speech, and to come back all in good shape and quite happy about the reception and the interaction with other people in South Africa. A last note that I want to make is the day that Rosemary died. We were a lot of her friends at the hospital with her. Herc had already left for the day because she was unconscious and he had spent so many hours there. So it was a circle mostly of women, and we each had on a white plastic robe that covered everything we wore, a kind of balloon with a tie around the waist to hold it to your body, and a shower cap on our head to cover our hair. So we were a motley group, to put it mildly, and all around her in white. We were singing songs after a few hours just to keep ourselves awake and present, and perhaps that she might hear something of our voices. And as we sang, I had this thought, what if she should wake and see us all around her and say to herself, well, heaven and earth are not so different than I thought. This indeed does demonstrate that I can be at home here. Even the angels can't keep a tune. That's Rosemary for me, and what a wonderful friend we had in Rosemary. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. If you have comments along the way that you'd like to make, I see some of you are making notes in the chat, and as we have time at the end, we'll come back to give you a chance to respond to some of those. I'd like to move now to her period at Garrett Evangelical Seminary, and first one to speak to that will be Barbara Troxell, the Reverend Barbara Troxell, who's been quite active in the Commission on the Status and Role of Women of the United Methodist Church, and was on the faculty at Garrett Evangelical Seminary when Rosemary was there. Barbara?
Thank you. It's a great delight to be here with all of you to honor and memorialize Rosemary, who became a very dear friend at Garrett Evangelical and certainly here at Pilgrim Place. As you know from what she already said about herself, she came to Garrett in 1976 and soon thereafter was installed as the Georgia Harkness Professor of Applied Theology. And as most of you know, Georgia Harkness was probably the premier woman theologian of the mid 20th century. And to have Rosemary in that position was wonderful for all of us. I came to Garrett Evangelical having read in 1988 as director of field education and professor of spiritual formation. Before being there, of course, Rosemary and I were of a similar age. She was a year younger than I, and I had read a lot of her books by that time, and very much share with her the combination in earlier decades of feminism and civil rights and liberation theology, and how they all intersected together, as she made so clear throughout her entire life. My office and hers were on the same floor at Garrett Evangelical. It was part of the seminary where those of us on that floor walked up and down 3 flights of stairs. There was no elevator right there. So we got good exercise. And there were several of us women faculty actually on that floor, as well as others elsewhere. The faculty women got together monthly. There were at different times 8 or 9 of us, including Rosemary, of course. Right next door to her was Linda Vogel in Christian Ed, Rosemary Keller right next door to my office until Rosemary Keller became dean. Later on, Ruth Duck moved in there as professor of worship, and Phyllis Bird in another part of the building, professor of Hebrew scriptures. We all got together regularly, at least once a month, for an evening meal together at each other's homes, and then a conversation about our lives, as well as various events and concerns at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Rosemary's hospitality was enormous. Both she and Herman had a large house in Evanston, and actually there always were a couple of students living there. Often, I remember well, often lesbian couples would live in part of the building of their house. When we would be over there for the evening meals, Rosemary was a great cook, wonderful hospitality, and both were from her as well as from her. Soon after Rosemary had her stroke here at Pilgrim Place, I wrote something, and I don't remember where it was published, but I found it the other day. And here it goes, because it says a lot about Rosemary and her relationship with students. She was a wonderful professor, of course. The students highly respected her and were very appreciative of her feminist theology, and again, the intersections she brought with other areas of concern in our wider community and world. Here's what I wrote. Her mentoring of women PhD candidates was superb, as evidenced by the Festschrift, Voices of Feminist Liberation, written by those PhD students for Rosemary's 75th birthday. As Mary Hunt pointed out, and this is something that Mary Hunt wrote in the National Catholic Reporter in October of 2014. As Mary Hunt points out, Rosemary's ability to really create colleagues in her students assures that her work will endure beyond her earthly life, end quote from Mary Hunt. And I think the way Mary Hunt states that is so very clear. Rosemary created colleagues among her students regularly. Then I went on to write, together with the other faculty women, we met monthly for an evening meal and significant conversation and sharing. Rosemary was a good cook and also enjoyed gardening, and she loved to do watercolor painting. She did that here at at Pilgrim Place as well. Once Rosemary told me that for her, painting was a meditative form. No words, but simply appreciation of the natural world and of art. Her work as a liberation and eco-feminist theologian, as well as her attention to the Palestinian situation and and her intense hope for their son David's mental health were lessons to all of us who knew her in Evanston and beyond. End quote. I also want to say that here at Pilgrim Place, she and I visited with one another often. And also, she, in recent years, from her stroke, she could no longer speak. She loved to come to events like Eucharistic Circle on Tuesday mornings. She'd be brought by a caregiver. And often at the end of this Eucharistic service, which was about a half hour every Tuesday morning, in fact, it's going on right now, today, I would go afterwards, take her hand and say to her, "It's Barbara," and she'd look at me very intently, and I'd say to her, "We were faculty together and lived on the same floor in our office, were in our offices on the same floor at Garrett Evangelical many years ago." She obviously understood and would squeeze my hand. And that happened many, many times. So although Rosemary in her latter years since the stroke could no longer speak, clearly there were things, elements very evident in her mind and heart about those around her and what was going on within her. I want to just close. I could say a lot more, but I want to just close by saying, on this All Saints' Day for Christians, November 1, I give deep thanks for Rosemary Radford Reuther, a great saint among us who's gone on into the new life, and yet is also a saint who inspires us, who continues to guide us, and continues to ground us in the reality of ecofeminism, liberation theology, and all that is needed for our life in this very, very tumultuous and violent world. So thanks be to God for Saint Rosemary Radford Reuther today. And that's enough for me.
All right, thank you, Barbara. We also have a student of Rosemary from the Garrett years, and the Reverend Joanne Carlson Brown was my associate as a pastor, not my associate pastor, but my colleague in the ministry in the Pacific Northwest United Methodist Conference. And I noted in her comments about retirement and whatever she wanted to say about retirement, she talked about Rosemary Radford Reuther and the kind of influence that she had. So I was pleased when Joanne Brown decided that she was willing to come and spend some time with us. Joanne?
Thank you, Ron. In 1975, I graduated from Mount Holyoke College. And those of you who don't know, it's a Seven Sisters Women's College in the East. And I applied and went to Garrett Evangelical because of the three emphases they had on the Church in the Black experience, the Peace Institute, and women in the church. So I arrived there in the fall of 1975, and there were 10 women out of 300 students, most of whom were Master of Christian Education, and there was one woman on the faculty, and that was DJ, who was the Christian Education professor. I also arrived there to find out that in the spring, the faculty had voted that no self-identified practicing homosexual would matriculate there. And I didn't know that. They didn't say anything. There wasn't anything in the application, where you check hetero, homo, bi, sheep. There just wasn't anything. So I felt a little weird, but I was the only openly gay or lesbian student there. And in 1976, when Rosemary arrived, I was elated because we actually had a woman faculty member who was going to teach theology and the other things and history that I loved. I may be the only one who actually possesses a copy of her dissertation on Gregory of Nazianzus. And I loved it and I read it because I have a PhD in church history and historical theology. We had so the women students of very minority in the community had a group called the Venom Sisters, and we rewrote hymns and had fun things to do that. But we found out that November 2nd was going to be Rosemary's 40th birthday. And so we organized a huge birthday party for her and surprised her with it. And she was delighted. We had a delightful time. But when Rosemary came, they were clear that she didn't have to have any advisees for a couple of years. But I really wanted to be her advisee. So I climbed up those 3 flights of stairs that Barbara talked about, and I stood in front of her door for 5 minutes. I couldn't know, I was too afraid to knock on the door because Rosemary Radford Reuther was on the other side. So I finally got my courage, knocked on the door. She let me in and petitioned the school, and I was her only advisee. And I had delightful time. One of the things, I used to sit in the office and watch her type articles. She would sit at the typewriter and just type, and then hand it to me to send it off. No rough draft, no anything. It was perfect, and we sent it off. She encouraged me to get a PhD because I had decided I was only going to be a pastor. And she said, no, you're really brilliant. I was like, oh, gee, thanks. So I got the university fellowship to go to Boston University. But one of the things that Rosemary continued to do after I graduated, and well, actually, I only graduated because of her. We had to write a statement of faith in order to graduate. And I went up to my 3rd year, and I went up to Rosemary and I said, I can't do this. I don't believe in anything anymore. And she said, okay, write what you don't believe. And so I was writing all this stuff that I no longer believed. And yes, indeed, by the time I was done, I could affirm what I did believe in that. And that was so liberating and gracious of her to allow me to do it that way. So she would take me to AA, American Academy of Religion meetings. She was the one that introduced me around and got me established in the academy. And I will be forever grateful. It's hard for a student to break into that. And I was able to give papers. Mary Elizabeth Moore was in the Wesley group that I was also part of. And so I really appreciated her support. She would take me to places, which was really good. I went to Sweden with her to a Kvina Praester gathering. And also while we were at Garrett, she was asked to give the Mars lecture at Northwestern. And so she invited me to come to the big dinner. And it was 1976 or 77. And the Episcopal Church had decided to ordain women. Across the street from Garrett was Seabury Western, very high Anglo-Catholic seminary. We used to refer to Sheridan Road as the Ecumenical Gulch. We would go over there on Reformation Day and sing "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" as we walked through their campus. And then November 1st, they would come in full drag and cense us and exercise Garrett. It was kind of fun. But we were sitting across some of the faculty members at Seabury Western, and they, at the dinner, they were just in front of us. We're like, where can we go now that Mother Church has betrayed us? Can we go to Rome? can we go to the east? And Rosemary, without putting her fork down, said, I don't care. Why don't you just go to hell? And kept eating. And I was like, oh, okay, moving along. She had just incredibly wonderful sense of humor. I would watch her doodle, and right after the Pope declared Humana Vitae, where in fact women could not be ordained because they didn't bear a resemblance to men or to Christ. So she drew this picture of the new clergy robes for Catholics, and they were trench coats. And at the appointed time during the Eucharist, they would turn to the congregation and flash them to show them that they bore natural resemblance to Jesus. And then she also doodled this St. Paul's Cathedral, and above it was St. Peter with his Peter, and he tied to the cathedral, and said, never had so much weight rested on one penis. It was just quite wonderful. So when I went to graduate school at Boston University, there's a BTI, so you get to go to any school. So I'm one of the few people that can say I had Rosemary Reuther and Mary Daly as teachers. And I was the only one that was related to the church in any of her classes. I took Mythic Patterns of Patriarchy 1 and 2, and Feminist Critique of Theology 1 and 2. I'm amazed I got a job with that on my transcript. But we would debate back and forth because every comment about the church was directed right at me. And I was like, oh, okay. So and at one point during our back and forth, she called me Rosemary's baby. And I was like, well, at least I don't take blood money from Jesuits, because she was teaching it at Boston College. But Mary and I had a good relationship as well. And a lot of people didn't realize that she had a softer personal side. Same thing with Rosemary. My many times with Rosemary in her house where she would protect when I was in Garrett, the Women's Caucus turned against me. We were supposed to do chapel. The Women's Caucus was supposed to do chapel, and I was going to help with communion service because I was ordained a deacon. And they sent my good friend to me the night before to say that they had decided I couldn't do communion because they didn't want me, a person like me, that close to the altar. And it just devastated me. And so I went to Rosemary in just absolute tears, actually pretty drunk, I have to say. I got pretty drunk. And she actually, I had stayed at her house for a couple of days. And she told the faculty that I was indisposed and that I was staying at her house. So she was so she's instrumental in my own work and my work with Mary in feminist theology, so that when I got a job at Pacific Lutheran University, being the only woman in a 10-member faculty, when I taught feminist theology, I was able to do that, as well as because of her patristic understanding that I got at Garrett, because I took those classes. It's just, I had a broad range of history, broad range of feminist theology, and Black theology as well, as starting to develop my own lesbian theology. I went to an AAR conference where she was speaking, and she was describing her experience with a woman who was brutally beaten and raped. And that when she came to, she said, at least there's one man that will understand me. And she was talking because she had a vision of the crucified Christ. So I went running up to Rosemary afterwards, and I was like, divine child abuse, you need to write about it. And she turned to me and said, no, you need to do it. And so I wrote a paper that was delivered at the International Theological Conference in 1984 in Vancouver, BC. And then when I was within 24 hours of being fired for writing that essay, Rosemary gathered some other folks who had heard the paper, Gregory Baum, a few other folks, and they wrote letters to the president and told them it was not shoddy scholarship, which was the argument they were using. It was cutting edge theology, and saved me from being fired. So there are many places where Rosemary has intervened in my life, but I am a very proud church historian, historical theologian, feminist theology, and all that encompasses. I don't talk about patriarchy, I talk about kyriarchy, which is the lording over everybody. So that umbrella includes all that people of domination and oppression. And I was moved to tears when I found out that Rosemary had died. We had been sending Christmas cards and things every year, and birthday cards. Tomorrow's her birthday, and also Herc's birthday, which is on the 11th. And it just deeply affected me. But so I'm one of the folks who can sit here and say, I was her student. And gave me the ability to stand up to Mary Daly and toe to toe, and also take the radical lesbian feminist theological stuff from Mary Daly. I was there, and I was at Boston University, and the people at Boston University couldn't understand why I was going to take classes from Mary Daly, who was this radical lesbian feminist. And when I got there, they didn't understand why I was at the church. Why was I going to seminary? Why was I doing any of this stuff? And I didn't feel like I fit anywhere. And I used to walk Commonwealth Avenue. If those of you know Boston College is at one end of Commonwealth, and Boston University is at the other. And I'd walk home, and I would stand on the Storrow Bridge. And I was so depressed because I fit nowhere that I stood there waiting for a truck to come by, because, I didn't want to get hit by a Volkswagen and just dent it. If you're going to do it well. And so I stood there maybe half an hour waiting for a truck, and no truck came. And I finally overcame that and went home. And it was until later that I found out there were no trucks allowed on Storrow Drive. And so I think that was God's intervention in that. But I have been blessed with Rosemary, with Herc. And I am the teacher and pastor that I am today because of her.
Thank you very much. We have a person. I was looking for someone who would understand Rosemary's connection to Palestinian liberation, and I discovered Kathy Bergen, who is a Russian Mennonite from Canada, who has been at work in the Middle East and was the host for Rosemary and Herc when they came to do their work in Palestine. So are you still with us? Kathy Bergen, we're glad to have you with us.
Yes, I am. And thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. Yes, I was, like I said, I was very struck by Rosemary's death. And it was like, it felt to me more than sad. It was sad, sad. I met Rosemary, and not in person, but I met her through reading her books when I was at seminary. I graduated from the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, which is our binational seminary in Elkhart, Indiana. I read her books and was very struck. It was for a course on liberation theology there. then finally, after my graduation, I went to Jerusalem with the first as a student for a semester, and then I went. I stayed there and worked with the Mennonite Central Committee, which some of you may know, the Mennonite Central Committee, MCC. It's the Relief, Development, and Peace arm of all Mennonite Anabaptist churches, U.S. and Canada. So I was working there with MCC, and a couple of things. I was teaching. One of the many things I did was teach at the Bethlehem Bible College, and so this becomes significant later when I tell you about meeting Rosemary in Jerusalem. I taught in the Bethlehem Bible College in Bethlehem, as well as the extension course in Gaza. So every week I, traveled off to Gaza and taught there as well as in Bethlehem. Well, I finally met Rosemary at Tantur, which some of you may know, the Ecumenical Institute of Tantur, which is just located between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. In fact, right actually on the boundary. She was doing a lecture there, and I used to attend all the lectures at Tantur by the various scholars who had been invited there. I went to Rosemary's lecture with Reverend Dr. Naima Teague, who some of you may know, and we both met Rosemary and Herc after the lecture, and Rosemary and I decided, to meet, and the upshot of all that was that she would follow me. She and Herc would come with me. I had an MCC car. They would come with me to both, to Gaza, to Hebron. And while I was teaching, they would, just explore Gaza, the refugee camps in Gaza. So the whole time, Herc and Rosemary were in Palestine at Tantur. I had a lot of contact with them. In fact, I organized some special trips for them of things they wanted to see and people they wanted to meet. So then, just moving on a few years, I had become a very good friend, and Mark Ellis became a very good friend of mine. Some of you may know him. He's a Jewish liberation theologian. He was also at Tantur. And over the years, our relationship, we just really had a lot of respect and liking for each other. So when Mark, who was the director of the Mary Noel Justice and Peace Institute, organized a summer of liberation theologians, he invited Naima Teague, who later became the founder of Sabeel in Jerusalem, the Palestinian Liberation Theology Center. And he invited me, not as a theologian, but I went. Naim was the theologian. I was the person who set the political stage there. So we were at this six-week liberation theology course with Gustavo Gutierrez and liberation theologians from literally all over the world. There was one weekend when Mark organized a birthday party for Gustavo Gutierrez, and other theologians came for that weekend. Rosemary came, and we hadn't seen each other for a little while. So she came. She not Herc at that time, but she and she came. And one evening, she and Mark Ellis and Naima Teague and I went for a walk, and Mark said to Naim, "So when are you going to organize the first Liberation Theology Conference in Palestine?" And all three of them looked at me and they said, "Well, Kathy, are you ready to organize it?" To make a long story short, Rosemary and Mark were, our mentors, they suggested various people to invite from all over the world, liberation theologians, to come and be in dialogue with Palestinian Christians. And that happened in March of 1990. It was a huge success, and in many ways, which I won't elaborate on, there isn't time to do that, but it was a huge success. And we, let's see, Bishop, I'm having a senior moment. The bishop from South Africa was invited, but he couldn't make it. But he became a very good friend of Naima Teague and became the person, sort of the person to support, Sabeel, and have his name stand as the person who supported the Palestinian Liberation Theology Center. Rosemary has been so influential in my life on so many different levels. Just watching the video brought back so many memories. Her incredible intellect, her sense of humor, which was amazing, and her humanity. And I could tell many personal stories about her. I realize there isn't time, but I would like to just, tell one where whenever I would go to Chicago, I would often stay with her and her. One time she and I decided to do a fundraiser for the Palestine Human Rights Information Center in Jerusalem. So we spent a whole day shopping, another whole day cooking, and we invited, whoever we knew in Chicago. We raised about $1,000. We cleared about $1,000 that I then took back to Jerusalem with me to give to the Palestine Human Rights Information Center. Just the last thing I would like to say is I was there for, in Jerusalem for 9 years. I lived in Jerusalem for 9 years. Then I went after being several other, Geneva at the United Nations. I was the rep of the Palestinian, of all international NGOs working on the question of Palestine. Then I went back, I went to Philadelphia, and that's when I saw Rosemary a lot more, because I would go to Chicago sometimes as part of my work and stay with them. In 2006, the Quakers invited me to come to Ramallah and develop a Quaker Peace Center there, which I did for 7.5 years. And Rosemary visited a couple of times with groups, and I would organize, help organize their schedule for their groups. But she is an amazing person, incredible intellectual, and just a wonderful human being and a great friend.
Well, thank you. Our last person in this long line of witnesses is Janice Poss. Did I pronounce that correctly? She's from right across the street from Pilgrim Place and John Cobb. She's at the Claremont Graduate University, where she's a PhD candidate. And one of the reasons many of us know her is that she's been in charge of the Pat Reif lecture, Pat Reif IHM lecture every year at the Claremont Graduate University. So Janice, let's hear what you have to share with us.
Well, thank you, Ron, and thank you, everybody. I feel almost a part of this community, even though I live a little bit distance away. So I just wrote something that for me is kind of like what I did with Rosemary, because I really wasn't her student. I almost was, but didn't quite happen. So here goes. In 2015, I had the privilege to finally have my conversation with Rosemary in the airport in Johannesburg, South Africa. We were awaiting our respective flights to go back to the US. What we spoke about was spontaneous, flowed easily and naturally. We spoke about women's empowerment because we had just come from Botswana, where we had conversed with women religious leaders who were shaping their people's faith, much as we were doing in the US. As many good friends, I cannot remember the first time I met or knew about Rosemary, but as I became more involved in my religious studies and women's struggles for equality, I heard her name, often after we organized the first Roman Catholic women priest mass in Los Angeles in 2006. I would see her, especially at the Pat Reef lectures, to which I came because women were talking about equality in all faith traditions. I was becoming aware at a very conscious level of the struggles against patriarchal hierarchies and kyriarchies, as Joanne had said, on a global level, most affecting women everywhere. Before I began my master's studies there, Rosemary gave 2 lectures at Loyola Marymount University. I sat in the back, then had her sign my books afterwards. I was shy, in awe of her, and how she had written about what I was just beginning to know and be able to articulate. Although a closet feminist all my life, because I struck out on my own on a quest to speak other languages living in Europe, I pursued a career rather than married life. I was unaware that I could have had both, yet never looked at it as an option because the men I would meet were all entrenched in the patriarchal paradigm of thinking they had all the answers, even for my life. I resisted. As I gained clarification through the nagging search for truth, I realized the global system needed change, adaptation, and an approach to truth and respect that Rosemary's writings brought us. She peeled back the layers of the onion of history, exposed the roots and inner core of how we as women needed to bring a new reality to our world, one of solidarity with our earth, its other living beings, and that we are all in this together. In my own Roman Catholic faith tradition, she helped me realize that we have a very messy church. But in the mess, we can find the kernels of the mustard seeds that are not spoiled. We can plant them in fresh soil in order to give them a chance to grow, survive, and provide the religious renewal that needs to include a feminist perspective and worldview if we are to heal the planet, heal each other, and create renewed religious doctrines that are authentic, healthy, and no longer abusive and codependent. This is what Rosemary and I discussed in that airport conversation, and one that for me is the touchstone that I carry forward for my responsible activism as a feminist and comparative scholar. The night that Rosemary suffered her stroke, I drove past her house to make sure I knew which was hers because many of the dwellings at Pilgrim Place resemble each other, and I wanted to be sure I went to the right house as I had some paperwork for her to sign the next day. In 2014, I had gone by to pick her up as a group of us were driving down to San Diego for the AAR meeting. This time I was on a mission, having her to sign off to allow me to audit a class in matristics she was giving a colleague and I. I was finally going to be able to study with her, which I was never able to do before because she always taught when I was at work. This was my chance. Alas, a dream dissolved, but still basking in its golden aura of possibility. Needless to say, when I heard she had a stroke, I was devastated. My heart skipped a beat, wondering if she would survive. She did. Life changes so quickly. Soon after, since Rosemary was now in nursing care at Pilgrim Place, the house had to be emptied. I helped. During this time, I met Rosemary's daughters, Becky and Mimi, and I knew they did not live nearby. I told them that if I could do anything for them or Rosemary, I would, since I lived close by. This offer became almost a 5-year learning journey with the other Rosemary, an other abled Rosemary who could no longer speak, who was still her, but not her. She was there in mind and body in another way. My first sign that made me aware of her continued awareness and understanding was after Women Church one Sunday in October when it was still hot in Claremont. Rosemary was in a wheelchair covered in blankets. Everyone was talking. Since I did not know all the women too well, I sat by myself and eye-shot of Rosemary and wondered if perhaps she might be too hot. I called out to her, "Rosemary, are you hot?" She looked at me, and either with her good hand or her head, she signaled that she was not. From that point on, I knew she understood everything that was going on. That was her first gift to me. Another time, I was sitting with her and reading to her from Chris Whedon's Feminist Practice and Post-Structural Theory that I was reading in preparation for my qualifying exams. Eventually, my voice gave out. She took the book from me and continued to read the next 10 pages by herself. She was there. Visiting frequently, I would wheel her around the grounds of Pilgrim Place, the neighborhood, and take her to Mass on Sunday across the street at Our Lady of the Assumption. One time, Teresa Ugar wheeled her all the way to CGU for the annual Pat Reef Memorial Lecture that I now coordinated. Last year, Kwak Pulan was speaking. They were so glad to see each other. Or when Lisa Isherwood came to see her one summer, they too were happy to see each other. Each time I visited her was in the presence of a woman of grace, but an intimacy that develops between those who spend time together. We would often sit in silence. As we know, Rosemary was economical in her use of words, even when speaking. So now without speech, she communicated in many other ways, but it was still direct. An expression, a wave of her hand to stay or leave, or just sitting in the evening, holding her hand until she dozed off. More than any theological concept or doctrinal exegesis, she taught me and gave me the ultimate gift, the gift of herself. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. It looks like we only have time for a couple of comments. I'm going to give Renny Golden a chance to make some summarizing comments if she'd like, and John Cobb a chance to make a response. And then if we have a little more time, you can ask questions. But Renny, anything, observations you'd like to make?
Well, I would love to talk about more of Rosemary's praxis. The time she went with us to Pamarala Air Force Base in Honduras on a peace march, but it's too long a story. But I just know that Rosemary was at every protest we asked her to come to. If we asked her to write up something, we had it the next day. So it was her continual commitment to a practice of justice, not simply a theory. But if there's other people that could get in a couple of questions, it would be great. I mean, this is kind of a non-Freudian process. It's been all presentation. So maybe some folks here have some questions for the end of this.
Well, I see Jiha Wang had a comment. Jiha? I see your raised hand. Good to see your face.
Yeah, I feel very sorry to hear this sad news about Rosemary, her passing. Many years ago, I took Cheryl Liao, the leading figure in China, promoting environmental movement. Okay, she interviewed Rosemary. Yeah, so I went to her beautiful house. I was impressed by the beautiful painting in her house. Yeah, and Claremont is small, but we always tell our Chinese friend, Claremont also big. We have two big fish. One is Dr. Cobb, one is Rosemary. Okay, yeah. Fortunately, both of them working on ecological issue. They care about our Earth, yeah, from different angle, yeah. Unfortunately, Rose, because of her health issue, we can't take her to China. Yeah, we feel it's big pity. I think her heart still always with China, want to China make the ecological turn. So we really hope Rosemary's family and the friend, continue her great work, to save our beautiful planet. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Ignacio.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew. I put it in the chat, but we went to Colombia and to the Roman Catholic Pontifical University of Xavier. It's called in Spanish La Javeriana, and that's when she was making the remarks about not reading Whitehead, because we invited her to be part of the sort of process side of the conversation, of the dialogue with the liberation theologians there. And that she said she would not read, but John affirmed that even if she never read Whitehead, that she really sounded a lot like a process thinker anyway. But also it was there that she went to be with women that were into reproductive issues, as she did in Nicaragua. And it's in Spanish, it's called Católicas por el Derecho a Decidir. And in the United States, it's Catholics for Free Choice. So she was very, very influential in Latin America in those kinds of issues, as she was with enormous amounts of other issues. So a wonderful person. And finally, I share with Barbara the impression that she always knew what was happening. When I talked to her at Claremont after the stroke, I always spoke to her in Spanish, and I always got a big smile and eyes that were telling me that she was understanding what she was saying, and the squeeze in my hand as well.
Thank you. I don't see any other raised hands, and Kathy, I appreciate your comments. So people will let me just read your message that you wrote to me, just to make sure, in case there were some that did not hear from Kathy Bergen. Kathy said, "I'm not sure how much you could understand due to something with my computer, but I wanted to say that I, as a white woman, could not organize the first Palestinian Liberation Theology Conference. But I said I'd be the arms and legs that the groups of Palestinian Christians decided to do. This group of 7 Palestinians later became the board of Sabil, which means a stream of living water in Arabic. It was an honor to work with Reverend Dr. Naim Atik, Rosemary Radford Reuther, and Mark Ellis to organize this first Palestinian liberation theology in Palestine." That word from Kathy Bergen, in case you had trouble understanding the garbled work before. We thank you very much for your participation in this remarkable tribute to Rosemary Radford Reuther, ecofeminist, liberation theology scholar, internationalist, and social activist. Thank you so much for your participation.